Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Max Hollein. I'm the director of the Fine Arts Museums. I want to welcome you for coming here to this symposium, and actually also I have to apologize for the weather for those of you who came from abroad. The title of this symposium is Coastal Connections, and it's announced as a mini-symposium. It's actually the 8th mini-symposium of our annual series, and when I looked at it, I have to say that I don't think it's actually that mini. It's actually, I would say that the topics that we tackle this morning are pretty grand, and I would say also the speakers that we have here this morning are pretty esteemed, so I would kind of skip the name mini from this symposium right now, but rather welcome our speakers. And I'm really happy that Lisanne Bolton is here, the Keeper of Africa, Oceania and the Americas at the British Museum, and Dennis Carr, Curator of the American Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, Benny Gualter, Curator of, at the Textile Museum in Jakarta, and Elena Phipps, lecturer and senior scholar at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So thank you so much for coming and for joining us here. I would also like to extend my thanks to the various departments here at the museum who've worked on making this program possible. And also I want to thank our friends and supporters of the Department of Africa, Oceania and the Americas here at the Fine Arts Museums. And special thanks obviously go also to Hilary Olcott, who I kind of make out here in the dark. It's very bright here, but I virtually don't see you. But Hilary Olcott, our Assistant Curator for Africa, Oceania and the Americas, who has kind of really worked on this and put this whole program together. And of course, I also want to thank Christina Helmich for her great leadership of that department. Our main topic are coastal connections. And I have to say, as you can see from my accent, coming from the heart of Europe, as an Austrian, being surrounded by mountains, so I'm well aware of the difference and the opportunities and challenges that vast coastal lines can represent. I mean, coasts are, of course, dynamic lines of geographical, but also cultural demarcation. And they face outwards and are constantly not only shaped by the waves, but also by the influxes of visitors, of newcomers, of new cultures that kind of come to the shore. And as a museum really positioned here in San Francisco, right at the Pacific Rim, we are keenly aware, of course, how water can also be an important pathway and a vital connective force between the coasts. In our galleries right now and on view actually until Sunday, so please take advantage of that. We have textiles being shown from the museum's collection for the very first time under the title The Sumatran Shipcloth. And these textiles, if you look at them, are replete with ship imagery. And they obviously speak to the central role that the sea plays in a maritime culture which is dispersed over a region that encompasses thousands of islands. And today our speakers will show how the extraordinary movement of artistic materials and also cultural commodities between distant shores has shaped the world of art, or maybe even better said, the world in general of today. So these stories that you will hear this morning are remarkable, and also what they reveal about local communities and cultural exchange stretching back thousands of years. For example, trade between Indonesia, New Guinea and China has been going on, as we know, for many centuries. And we've seen actually multiple cycles of boom and bust for kind of what we would now probably call almost like odd commodities, such as bird of paradise skins or sandalwoods used in kind of areas of fashion, furnishing and other areas. Beyond New Guinea, voyaging canoes piled the Pacific using celestial navigation centuries before Europeans set out on their voyages. In the 16th century, Europeans seeking art, luxury goods, and raw materials established a global trade, and these caused networks encompassing Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and basically formed also the global world, how we experience it in a global economy today. We will cover certainly a lot of ground today. And it's the mission of the Fine Arts Museums here in San Francisco, and especially also of the young, to not only engage with our diverse audiences, but to present and also to energize and contextualize opportunities of understanding of art of our diverse cultures around the globe. You will see that, of course, in our program this fall already with our major show on Teotihuacan, which will then travel on to the Los Angeles County Museum. You will see that in a presentation of extraordinary paintings by actually a Czech painter who kind of then emigrated to a very different area and kind of painted the Maori priests, Gottfried Lindauer. You will see this also in an exhibition that we are currently preparing on the fashion of Islam. And on the other hand, you will see it also in some contemporary acquisitions that we have just recently done, especially, for example, on an important video piece by the Propeller Group, which basically combines cultural connections between Vietnam and California. In that sense, we are building local and global connections between artists and communities, and we want to and need to and try to dissolve boundaries so that in making a way, on paving a way for new cultural relationships between people, cultures, and a global community. So I'm really happy that this symposium is taking place here this morning, and I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Max, for those words of welcome. And also thank you to all of you for braving the weather and being here today with us for our 8th annual Mini-Symposium. I'm Hilary Olcott, the Assistant Curator of the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas here at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. For today's program, Coastal Connections, I thought that we could begin our proceedings, in the semi-arid highlands of central Mexico. The ancient city of Teotihuacan flourished in the first half of the first millennium AD. At its peak around the year 400, the city was home to as many as 125,000 residents, making it the most populous settlement in the Americas and the 6th largest in the world. Ancient Teotihuacan covered an area of approximately 25 square kilometers. It was laid out and built in a gridded urban plan. The rivers that run through the city were diverted into canals to conform to the grid-like design. The city was centered on a civic ceremonial core, which is recognizable by its 3 monumental structures: the Moon Pyramid, the Sun Pyramid, and Feathered Serpent Pyramid. These buildings, as well as dozens of smaller stepped platforms and room complexes, were built along a broad avenue called the Street of the Dead. Today, this region is known as the Teotihuacan Archaeological Zone. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and is visited by more than 4 million people per year. Most of the residents of Teotihuacan lived outside of this ceremonial center in single-story permanent buildings known as apartment complexes. Unlike the apartment buildings that we think of today, Teotihuacan's complexes housed family units of around 40 to 60 individuals. The buildings were used for domestic and ritual activities, but were also the site of significant economic endeavors, namely the manufacture of prestige and practical goods. The consistent residential architecture, extensive water management system, and neatly gridded urban plan imply that Teotihuacan was overseen by a powerful and highly centralized governing body. The city's artistic program suggests that this ruling power held a measure of ideological control as well. Artwork from Teotihuacan is idiosyncratic and instantly recognizable. Painted murals and ceramic vessels are rendered with bold lines and often bright contrasting colors. Space is flattened, so subjects appear to move along a single plane. Human figures are squat and blocky, pictured with generic features and often elaborate costumes. Supernatural creatures like feathered serpents and fiery jaguars abound. Designs and motifs like water, stars, and flowers are codified and repeated. Unlike with the contemporaneous ancient Maya, the symbols in Teotihuacano art have yet to be deciphered. The opacity of the visual language and lack of individualized portraits make it difficult to extract ideological information from Teotihuacan's artistic program. Curiously, archaeologists have not yet discovered any burials of elite individuals within or below the three main pyramids, as would be expected from findings at other Mesoamerican sites. So, while it's clear that Teotihuacan was governed by a strong socio-political and ideological entity, the nature of the entity and the system of control remain relatively unknown. One theory about the genesis of Teotihuacan's power is its proximity to and monopoly over obsidian sources. In a region without metallurgical practices, obsidian was a valuable material that was used to make razor-sharp blades and brilliant ornaments. The brittle volcanic stone is difficult to process, so significant skill and specialized knowledge is required. Approximately 400 obsidian workshops have been identified within the city of Teotihuacan, where blanks and blades were hewn and prepared for export. The control over this luxury good allowed Teotihuacanos access to a number of foreign commodities, like copal resin used for incense, tropical bird feathers for ornamentation, and cotton for textiles. Shell was another particularly popular commodity and is a common theme in the artistic program. Mold-made ceramic shells adorn incense burners, bivalves and gastropods appear in paintings, and carved stone shells decorate architectural facades. Shells were also used as a raw material. They were inlaid into sculptures and fashioned into beaded jewelry. Shells were not only a medium or a subject, but were valued objects unto themselves. Shells and shell fragments have been discovered in the burials of low and elite status individuals. They have been found in offering caches, in residential complexes, and at each of the three main pyramids. The recent discovery of a tunnel under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid yielded a cache of approximately 50,000 objects, including scores of decorated and undecorated shells like the ones seen here. If shells were so prevalent at Teotihuacan, why then were they a commodity? Of the thousands of samples that have been studied, nearly all of the identifiable shells were determined to be marine mollusks. Therefore, they could not have been harvested from nearby lakes or rivers, but rather must have been transported from distant ocean shores. The question then arises, what was the mechanism of Teotihuacan's coastal connection? The city sits about 2,200 kilometers above sea level. The Gulf Coast is minimally 235 kilometers away, and the Pacific Coast more than 100 kilometers further still. So, were the shells brought directly to the city? Or were they passed through numerous exchanges along established trade routes? Were they transported in small number or in massive deliveries? If it was the latter, who hauled the shells across land without the use of beasts of burden or wheeled vehicles? Did a single family or lineage control the shell trade? Or was it institutionalized within the greater economy of Teotihuacan? Also, why were shells so popular? Was it their association to life-giving water or a watery underworld? A reference to exotic goods? The allure of distant ocean shores? While we don't know the answers to any of these questions, I am very pleased to say that we will have a unique opportunity to ponder them here at the De Young. This fall, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco will be hosting the exhibition Teotihuacan, City of Water, City of Fire. Organized in partnership with Mexico's Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, the exhibition will feature over 200 works from the ancient city, including nearly all of the objects shown in this presentation. Many of these works will be on view for the first time, particularly the incredible findings from the tunnel underneath the Feathered Serpent Pyramid. So, mark your calendars, save the date, and come ponder the wonders of ancient Teotihuacan. Now, I will turn the program over to our esteemed speakers. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to share a brief note about the format of today's program. There will be 2 lectures, a short break around 11 a.m., and then 2 more lectures. We will then invite all 4 speakers up to the stage for a joint question and answer period. So please hold all questions and comments until the end. Finally, if you have not already done so, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones. So, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Lysant Bolton. Lysant is keeper of the Department of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas at the British Museum. Her research focuses on Vanuatu, where she has worked collaboratively with the Vanuatu Cultural Center for many years, but she has a broad interest in the Pacific region, especially in Pacific textiles. Her publications include Unfolding the Moon, Enacting Women's Custom in Vanuatu, the co-authored Art in Oceania, A New History, and the co-edited Melanesia, Art and Encounter. More recently, she has worked on Australian material, resulting in the co-authored catalog Indigenous Australia Enduring Civilization. Please join me in welcoming Lysant to the stage.
Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak at this symposium. I'm very grateful, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other papers. And I hope that this is interesting to you. It's a topic that I kind of devised because of this symposium, and the more I worked on it, the more I thought, this is quite a big topic, and there's much more to say, but I'm going to say what I can, and I hope it's of interest to you. So the Pacific was explored and settled by people voyaging on double-hulled sailing canoes, using the stars, knowledge of birds, swells, tides, winds, and clouds to navigate the ocean. In the 20th century, we often used to think, or in the late 20th century, people used to think that Pacific Islanders got to other islands by accident. They didn't get to other islands by accident. They went out looking for islands, and they found them. And when Europeans first arrived, the Pacific was alive with canoes. There were canoes around islands, but there were also canoes right out in the middle of the ocean. But colonialism wasn't good for Pacific canoes. The big trading canoes like this one had largely disappeared from the region by around the end of the First World War, 1925-ish. This was for a number of reasons, some of mostly resulting from colonial action, sometimes quite intentional. The French administration in Vanuatu, which is an island group in the Western Pacific, imposed a ban in 1920 preventing local inter-island trading because it was interfering with their own commercial interests. So people still do make smaller canoes for local travel, and as some of you may know, in Polynesia there's quite a big movement to revive inter-island sailing on canoes. But in the Western Pacific, the big canoes have gone, and people sometimes make smaller canoes, but they use European textiles for sails. What we know about sails, we know mostly from early observers in the late 19th and early 20th century. European observers found these sailing canoes quite beautiful. The famous early anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, who was in New Guinea from 1914, commented about canoes like this that he could scarcely imagine anything more strangely impressive than a fleet of crab-clawed sailing canoes. Crab-claw sails being the sails you can see. Another early observer, Arthur Grimble, describing a canoe from Kiribati, remarked that the slim vessel with her frail spars and raking wings looks from afar like some enormous dragonfly poising and swooping over the lagoon. A lot of what's been written about voyaging in the Pacific is focused on the canoes themselves. Much less attention has ever been paid to the textiles, the sails that make this voyaging possible. And as far as I know, and I probably have quite a bit more work to do, but not many sails still remain in museum collections around the world. So this paper draws together some of what's known about those sails. But I'm just going to begin with the kind of history of sailing, because it's good to realise what a history this is. The Pacific was first settled more than 60,000 years ago by people crossing the straits between the islands of what is now Indonesia and the continent now known as Australia. At that time, during the Ice Age, sea levels were much lower. You can see the outline of the continents as they were then. And so the continent of Australia included New Guinea. So people were in what is now New Guinea 55,000 years ago. And they settled the islands immediately to the north of New Guinea by about 30,000 years ago. That's, for those of you who know them, the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomon Islands. I think that the first immigrants to Sahul, who were crossing the water barrier between those islands, must have done so using fibre technologies and almost certainly sails. We don't have any archaeological evidence for that, but it's just interesting not only that fibre appears in rock art from 20,000 years ago in northern Australia, but, for example, the Yolngu people of northern Arnhem Land, in their epics, fibre is very important, and they say that the first ancestors carried woven basket and mats as the original sacred objects of the creation period. So just because we only find stone and pottery, we tend to forget fibre as something that existed an extremely long time ago in human history. The rest of the Pacific was settled by people who swept in from the northeast about 3,500 years ago, as this map kind of shows. These people are generally speaking known as the Lapita people, and they arrived, as archaeological research has shown, sailing canoes, making beautiful pottery, and building stilt houses over water. So they came with a huge amount of material culture. And they came into the Bismarck Archipelago. The places that I'm going to be talking about include Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, which is marked there, and if you look at the arrow that swoops up towards the Caroline Islands, under about the 00 of 12,000, there's Kiribati, which I'm also just going to talk about. So I'm going to be talking only about that western part of the Pacific. Because the Lapita people settled the whole of the Pacific, or their descendants settled the whole of the Pacific, theirs is the language from which all Pacific languages developed. Linguists comparing these languages have found some words common to all of them, rather like Latin words occur in many European languages. These words include terms for steering oars, bailers, anchors, cargo, boat owner, and sail. So even at the beginning, these people were accomplished canoe owners and sailors. And they were traders. Like the Dutch in New York, they didn't arrive to settle, but rather to set up beachheads and trading stations. And in their first encounters, especially into the Western Pacific, that's just what they did. They found places with water and they settled small encampments. An archaeologist who's done a lot of the research on this period, Matthew Spriggs, suggests that those first people, the Lapita people, were going back and forth through the islands of the Western Pacific so frequently that they were almost running bus routes through the region, bringing and taking resources. I've met other archaeologists who think it's not perhaps buses, but who knows? The spread of these first settlers can be traced because of their pottery, thin-walled pottery decorated with complex, impressed and incised designs. But after 1,000 years or so, that pottery disappears from the archaeological record, and instead we find settled communities living in the islands of that whole region. In some places, quite a few places, they even stopped making pottery altogether. Not in New Guinea, however. People were still making and trading pottery in New Guinea when the Europeans arrived. In particular, there was a regular trade of pottery for sago along the southern coast of New Guinea, from Hanauabada, which is where Port Moresby is now, east along the coast to the Gulf of Papua. In 1910, someone called F.R. Barton described how, quote, every year at the end of September or the beginning of October, the season of the southeast trade winds being then near its close, a fleet of large sailing canoes makes this trade journey. The canoes are laden with earthenware pots of various shapes and sizes which are carefully packed for the voyage in dry banana leaves. The canoes return during the northwest monsoon after an absence of about 3 months, laden with sago. These were vessels that could take 30 to 40 people. And in 1883, the young missionary James Chalmers sailed in one of these canoes on a trading voyage down to the Gulf of Papua. He writes evocatively of winds and currents, of seeing the lights of the other canoes in the distance at night, and of the tension of getting the canoes through the gaps in the reef at their destination. Hanno-Abada was by no means the only trading centre on that coast, along the south coast of New Guinea. Mailu, further along the east coast, was another. The Mailu traded widely along the south coast of New Guinea. They were middlemen traders. They'd go somewhere and get something, and then they'd take it to someone else and get something for that, and then they'd bring the first thing back. And they didn't. They, as you can see, they were living in a village right on the coast. Their lives were traders, and they were kind of big characters along the region. They also sailed slightly different canoes with only a single sail. But the great thing is that we have a photo of one of their sails, which is this photo taken by Frank Hurley, the famous Australian photographer, in 1921. It's a rare image that enables us to see how the sail is composed of strips of matting sewn together. This matting would have been made almost certainly of plaited pandanus leaf. Pandanus is a palm, sometimes known as the screw palm or the cabbage palm, and many different textiles across the Pacific are made of plaited pandanus. And in a small piece of advocacy, I will say that a lot of people do a lot of work on the absolutely extraordinary bark cloth of the Pacific, but I think that we need to pay attention to the plaited pandanus textiles of the Pacific, because some of them are quite extraordinary, and it's a whole part of the history of the Pacific that we don't pay enough attention to. Sails is one part of that. So Malinowski lived in Mailu, but then later he lived in the Trobriand Islands off the eastern tip of New Guinea. He was actually there throughout the First World War. He describes the impact of a fleet of trading vessels arriving there, describing the effect of their triangular sails as being like butterfly wings scattered over the water, adding, with the harmonious calls of conch shells blown in unison as they sail in, the effect is quite unforgettable. Malinowski describes sails as being made by communal labour. We don't have many descriptions of sail making. The outline of his description provides us is that the outline of the sail was first pegged on the ground, as a rule an old sail being used as a pattern. The sail was made of wide ribbons of prepared pandanus palm leaf, which tends to be about that wide. The leaf was dried and prepared in various ways, and they were sewn together using awls made of flying fox bone, and using as thread narrow strips of specially toughened pandanus leaf. 2 layers of pandanus ribbons were sewn on top of the other, one on top of the other, to make a solid fabric. I don't have an image to accompany this, but a very similar technique was used in what is now the nation of Kiribati, further to the east, where that 00 was on the previous map, where sails were also made of wide ribbons of dried and processed pandanus leaf, sewn together edge to edge and end to end using an ordinary tacking stitch. The thread was made of the fibrous portion of the pandanus root. The edges of the sail were bound with doubled leaf, and sometimes the coconut cord was whipped on for extra strength. Arthur Grimble, who described Kiribati sails in 1924, commented that such sails were beautifully light and very durable if kept well rubbed with coconut oil. Being oiled, they had the great advantage of drying quickly if the canoe happened to capsize. But such was the labour in their making that sometimes ordinary matting was used instead. Some sails are still made in the Trobriand, so we have this photograph. But Malinowski, in describing something that happened to him during the First World War, describes sailing in a Trobriand's canoe and commenting that when the sail is hoisted, its heavy, stiff folds of golden matting unroll with a characteristic swishing and crackling noise, and the canoe begins to make headway. The water rushes away below with a hiss, and the yellow sail glows against the intense blue of sea and sky. I'm reading these quotes because it gives us a sense of these textiles, but I'm also reading them because one of the things that everybody who writes about canoes in the Pacific comments on is how passionately interested in the canoes people who owned them were, how kind of concerned they were. Deborah Battaglia writes about canoes in the Louisiana archipelago, and she quotes a young man who says, when you wake up at night and you lie awake thinking, all you think about is canoes and gardens. That's what you worry about. And Malinowski says that we can hardly imagine the sort of romance, the magic that canoes were for men in the Trobrians. Somebody else makes the perhaps less charming analogy, but he says it's just like men with cars. But I think if I read these quotes of eyewitnesses, it just gives you some sense of that kind of feeling that people had around canoes. And of course, they didn't just make sails, they went to enormous detail to decorate those canoes. So you'll see in the previous image there's a splashboard right at the front of the canoe. This is a much earlier one, which is now in the British Museum collection, collected on the Rattlesnake voyage in 1849. So men lavished attention and decoration on their canoes and also on their sails, but we'll get to that in a second. It's worth pointing out that although many Pacific sails were triangular, not all were. This China Straits canoe would have been used in short and local voyages among the islands in eastern Papua, rather than in long-haul journeying. So there were actually the big sailing canoes used triangular sails on the whole, but there were lots of other kind of sail types. We, thanks to Arthur Grimble, we have information about another aspect of canoes, which I think is one of the aspects that's gotten a bit lost. But in Kiribati, the peak of the sail was decorated with pennants that were like flags, signalling the family affiliation of the canoe's owners, their clan. This crest, which was called Te Maro Tabo Ariki, which sort of means roughly belt or girdle of the sacred leader, belonged to one such family. Arthur Grimble recalls that these crests were always on the canoe. So when you looked out in the lagoon or you looked out in the distance and you could see it, if you knew what family, who it was out there on the canoe, was kind of a personalised number plate. Arthur Grimble records that this crest was supplemented on gala occasions with a dressing of textile pennants on the fore and aft mast stays and on the stay from the outrigger to the masthead. Grimble commented on how attractive a canoe decked out with scores of fluttering flags could look. In the small islands off Malakula in Vanuatu, people called themselves the Sea People because they were the major traders in their region, and this is a very accurate model of one of their canoes that was collected before 1881. The sails of these canoes were called Nakamban on Vau Island, meaning wing. Women plaited pandanus into strips that was then sewn together by the men into the sails. This sail design has a unique concave upper edge with long upward pointing ends that are referred to as wingtips. Small island elders say that this sail was designed by ancestors who study the flight of birds. And technically, this is a very effective sail form. The early ethnographer John Layard reports that some such sails were woven with the decorative head of a bird in the middle of the upper curved edge of the sail, creating an image of a large bird with outstretched wings. This is where we begin to regret the fact that there aren't many sails in museum collections, because here and there and now and then you find in the literature references to the designs that were plaited into sails, the images that could be seen from far off. And I don't yet know of anywhere where there is a sail from Malakula with a bird's head plaited into the design, but it would be wonderful to find one. And I haven't yet found a photograph either, but maybe yet, or maybe someone in the audience knows of one, which would be very exciting. These sails were often dyed red using a vegetable dye, which was widely used on textiles in Vanuatu or in the Vanuatu archipelago. And they presented a striking image on the water. The missionary ethnographer Robert Codrington described them as appearing like red butterflies at sea. But like the canoe pennants from Kiribati, they weren't dyed red, I don't think, merely as to look beautiful. But again, they were designed to make a statement about the owner of the canoe, his rank, who he was. In that part of the Pacific, in North Vanuatu, men took part in status alteration systems by which they achieved a higher and higher status through their lives, and the status was somewhat like the kind of status we get from a degree. You know, you didn't actually talk about it on a daily basis. It didn't affect how people treated you on a daily basis necessarily, but you became a more and more senior person, and it did have effects. And in the Banks Islands, people who achieved higher and higher status, that was reflected in nearly everything that they made and owned. So they really took this to the max, and they made they had different kinds of eating implements, they all kinds of different things, what they wore, marked some of this status. It would be like wearing your academic hood all day, every day. But a colleague of mine, a New Vanuatu colleague of mine, Ellie Field, told me, but I can't find it in my notes at the moment, I'm going to ring him up and ask him, that the red sails were part of that status. So only high-ranking men could have red sails. So what there is to learn about sails is enormous, but what there is to see about how magical they were, I hope I've made clear to you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Listen. I am very pleased to announce our second speaker, Dennis Carr. Dennis is the Carolyn and Peter Lynch Curator of American Decorative Arts and Sculpture at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. He holds graduate degrees from Yale University in the History of Art and the Winter Tour program in Early American Culture. Dennis was a co-curator of the MFA's award-winning Art of the Americas wing and a contributing author to the books A New World Imagined, Art of the Americas, Painting a Map of the 16th Century Mexico, Land, Writing, and Native Rule, and Art and Industry, Rhode Island Furniture, 1650 to 1830. Dennis recently organized the critically acclaimed exhibition at the MFA, Made in the Americas, The New World Discovers Asia, which was awarded grants by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Terra Foundation for American Art. Please join me in welcoming Dennis to the stage.
Thank you, Hillary, for the kind introduction, and to Max for the warm welcome. So this morning I'd like to speak about a topic that I explored in an exhibition, as Hillary mentioned, called Made in the Americas, The New World Discovers Asia. The exhibition explored the early trade between Asia and the Americas, which began in the 16th century, and the influence that the imports from Asia, like costly silks and fine porcelains from China, delicate lacquerwares and folding screens from Japan, and painted and embroidered cottons from India, had on the artistic production of the Americas during the colonial period from the 16th century through the 19th century. The exhibition looked widely across the Americas, from the French and English settlements of North America and the Caribbean, to the Spanish viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, to the Portuguese colony of Brazil. This morning, I'm going to focus on a specific aspect of this trade, which is called the Manila Galleon trade, which began around 1565 and lasted for an astonishing 250 years until 1815. We tend to think of globalism as a recent phenomenon, but in fact, globalism had its roots over 500 years ago when ships carrying explorers and later goods connected the world as never before. Situated between Asia and Europe, the Americas were literally at the center of the first large-scale, worldwide trading network, and through that network, they became the crossroads of a new global artistic culture. In the 16th century, the arrival of these treasured trade goods from Asia sparked a remarkable interchange of artistic styles and practices. Artists and patrons from North, Central, and South America, both indigenous and recent arrivals from Europe and elsewhere, embraced this fad for Asian objects, and in response, created their own hybrid works, made in the Americas, but envisioning Asia. So the Manila Galleon trade route, which I mentioned at the outset, is the red lines that connect Asia with Mexico. The ships that left Manila, usually laden with goods collected from all over Asia, China, Japan, India, what became known as the Spice Islands, they would sail north towards Japan and follow the trade winds across the Pacific, and they would make landfall around where we are today here in San Francisco. And then they would sail down the coast, sometimes stopping illegally at other ports to offload their goods. But the main offloading of goods took place in the port city of Acapulco. Then these goods were taken overland to central Mexico, and the goods that were intended for Spain would then go to Veracruz on the eastern side of Mexico, then onward to Havana, Cuba, and from Havana, Cuba to Spain. And the Portuguese, the English, and the Dutch took the western routes from Asia, sailing around Africa into the Atlantic. And a lot of the Portuguese ships would stop briefly in the port cities of Salvador de Bahia or Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So the Manila Galleon route across the Pacific was quite tedious. It took about 5 to 8 months, depending on the winds. And it was described as a tedious and dreadful voyage by someone who took the ships in the 16th century. So the exchange, of course, began in Asia. And the Portuguese were the first to enter the Asian markets, and the first to enter the Japanese markets in 1543. This is a screen that we included in the exhibition that shows the European traders trading with the Japanese, probably in Nagasaki. This is one of a pair of screens. And you'll notice there's intermingled with a lot of these traders were also Jesuits. The Jesuits accompanied some of the early Portuguese voyages to Japan, and they had a major impact in Japan for a short period of time, up until about 1615, when the Japanese started to close down to the Western market. And there is one particular Jesuit, his name is Alessandro Valignano, and he was like 6'5". And you can imagine what he really stuck out in Japan. And I think he's the guy. Look at this really tall fellow here. That must be Alessandro in the screen. So this is a remarkable object that showed up in Spain in the 20th century. It is a Japanese altarpiece made with Nambon lacquer with inlaid mother of pearl and a gilded lacquer surface. It's a very small object. It's about this tall. It's a devotional object. It's about 5 inches deep. And inside, it holds a series of paintings which were added in Mexico sometime during the 18th century. And the paintings show the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is, if you know, the patron saint of New Spain. And so this little lacquer altar was made in Japan, probably left the port at Nagasaki, somehow finds its way to Manila, from Manila to Acapulco, Acapulco to Mexico City. There, a local artist adds these 5 beautiful paintings of the Virgin of Guadalupe, probably 200 years later. And then this piece travels onward to Spain. And by 1786, it's in the possession of a bishop in Mondragon, Spain. And we know this because there's a note written on the back of it that says this, that it was being used for indulgences in 1786. But it's just like one of these early global objects that was only possible after the 16th century. So this is a map of what happened to some of these Asian goods once they arrived at the port of Acapulco. So Acapulco is on the western side of Mexico right here. And this map actually reminds me very much of the map of Teotihuacan that Hillary showed, looking at how some of these, the shells and other coastal materials made their way into central Mexico. And so the goods would be taken overland from Acapulco up to Mexico City, which is in central Mexico. Teotihuacan, by the way, is just north of Mexico City. And some of the goods, as I mentioned before, would go on to Veracruz and then onward to Spain. many of the goods, probably most of the goods, stayed in Mexico. And some of the goods were transported 1,000 miles north along the Camino Real, or the Royal Road, all the way to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where in the 16th century we have inventory evidence of Chinese porcelains and silk textiles, for example. In the 18th century, we have an inventory reference for kimono being used in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And one of my favorite references is a woman who in the 18th century is imprisoned, and she's clearly a very wealthy woman because she brought her 4-poster bed into the jail cell with her, and it's described in the inventory as being covered in imported Chinese silk damask. She was living pretty well. And in archaeological sites in Santa Fe today, we've found, and also I would say San Gabriel, which is an earlier settlement in this region, we've found evidence of Chinese and Japanese porcelains that were used there in the 16th and early 17th centuries, including the fragments here on the left. And the one that has a little red enamel overglaze probably relates to an object that's on the right. So they were getting pretty fancy goods at a very, very early date. So many Chinese porcelains entered the market in Brazil that they started tiling roofs with them, and this is the steeple of a church in Cachoeira in Brazil. The first Spanish galleons that sailed in 1571 carried 22,300 Chinese porcelains. That's a lot of porcelain in a shipment. That's basically 2 ships worth of porcelains. And now multiply that trade by 250 years, and you begin to get a sense of how many objects were flooding the American market. So we see in Cachoeira, they're tiling roofs with them. In Mexico, they're building fountains with them. This is a fountain in San Angel, a neighborhood in Mexico City that was probably started, I'm guessing, sometime in the 18th century, and is simply encrusted with porcelains collected for 150, 200 years. So one object that we had in the exhibition was actually one of the smallest objects in the exhibition. It was discovered at an auction in the Netherlands, I think in 2004. And the fellow who bought it, who lives in Ohio, said that it was miscatalogued at the auction, and it was so inexpensive that they had to add more objects to the lot to make it a complete lot. So he was able to acquire it. He thought that it had an early coat of arms, so that's why it was interesting to him. So he brought it home to Columbus, Ohio, and he starts to research the coats of arms on this little plate. And he quickly realizes that the arms on the left are those of the Viceroy of Peru in the late 16th century, and the arms on the right are those of his wife. And in 1592, this viceroy records in a letter to the Secretary of the King of Spain that he had just received a shipment of curious and fashionable household goods from Manila. And if this plate was part of that 1592 shipment, which we believe it was, it would make it the earliest Chinese export porcelain made for the European market with a Spanish coat of arms on it. That's incredible. And it's probably part of a much larger set. And it's interesting that this piece was intended not for royalty in Spain. It was intended for the viceroy in Lima, Peru. So imagine, if you will, what it would have been like to order a plate from Lima, Peru in 1590, let's say. So the order would have to come north, somehow get north to Mexico City, would sail across to Manila, from Manila to Macau, and from Macau inland to Jingdezhen, where the Chinese porcelain factories were located. They make the order. I hope they get it right. And then they ship it back from Jingdezhen to Macau, to Manila, to Acapulco, and then south back to Peru. And it would have been a distance of, I would say, well over 10,000 miles, and would have taken, I would suspect, years to send an order all the way to China and back. So why was it that the viceroy had the ability to order China in the 16th century? And the answer is largely silver. They were discovering vast silver deposits in Peru during the 16th century, and it made Peru one of the wealthiest places on earth at the time. And it was right at this moment when China is developing a silver-based economy, and so they're hungry for the raw silver. And the silver, 40% of which from Peru might have gone to Asia, fueled the Asia trade and gave the Peruvians and Europeans living in Peru purchasing power in Asia, and that's why they were flooded with trade goods. So almost immediately after these goods start arriving, local artists began making objects that simulated or replicated or imitated what were coming off the galleons. And we see almost immediately potteries springing up in central Mexico, specifically in the town of Puebla, southeast of Mexico City, where they start making earthenware pottery that simulates the Chinese blue and white porcelains. They don't have the materials needed to create true porcelain, but they can kind of replicate it using materials at hand. So these are two very nice, a basin and a two-handled jar that were in the exhibition. And this is another interesting piece, kind of a modest piece, but I want to focus on the symbol of it. Now, a lot of the Chinese vessels would have phoenix birds flying on them, and this one, made in Puebla, in the early part of the 18th century, has replaced the phoenix bird, which is often shown flying in an inverted position, with a native quetzal bird, a bird that would have been known to any Mexican or Guatemalan, a small bird with long, colorful tail feathers. And here's another interesting jar, which shows a crane standing atop a cactus, which I'm sure has never occurred in nature. A crane standing atop a cactus. And I was just wondering where would that imagery come from? Why would that be an important symbol for a Mexican audience? And I think the answer is the legend of the founding of the city of Tenochtitlan, where it was prophesied to the Mixtec that they would find their homeland after seeing a miraculous image of an eagle standing atop a cactus with a serpent in its mouth. And if you've seen the Mexican flag lately, that's the central image of Mexico. And I show on the screen on the right side an image out of a 16th century codex showing this kind of miraculous image of the eagle standing atop a cactus. So I'm imagining what we're seeing here is a conflation of the eagle with a crane, an Asian crane, but standing atop a cactus. So lacquerwares were another major product that was being imported into the Americas at a very early date. This is a small book rest that was made for the Jesuit order. The Jesuit seal is right on the front of it with the IHS and the cross above it. And again, like in the case of the Talavera pottery, we see local artists in Mexico beginning to produce objects that are inspired by the Asian imports. And this is a type of painting that was invented in Mexico sometime in the 17th century that is known as enconchado painting. The word in Spanish for shell is concha, so enconchado means shelled or inlaid with shell. And the Mexican artists start painting these images. They're oil paintings on board usually, but they're inlaid with mother of pearl shell. And in this case, we see an image of St. Francis Xavier, one of the first Europeans to missionize in Asia. He's standing at the left, and his whole body is made of mother of pearl shells that are inlaid into the surface. And he's surrounded by the four parts of the world: Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas, personified. And there's a fifth figure there who's unfurling a map of China and pointing to it in a gesture kind of inviting St. Francis's spiritual conquest in Asia. But the Japanese lacquers had a major impact on artistic production in Mexico and Peru and other places in the Americas. This is a very wonderful example that was made in Mexico. And I put on the screen a quote from 1604 written by a Mexican poet. And he says, "Mexico, in thee Spain and China meet, Italy is linked with Japan, and now finally a world united in order and agreement." So even as early as 1604, only 40 years after the trade begins, they have such a consciousness of Mexico's role as the linchpin between the Trans-Pacific and the transatlantic trading networks. And in Mexico City, I show an image of the Zocalo, the main plaza of Mexico City, and right in the center of it was the market where the Asian goods were sold. That's the market with the red tiled roof in the foreground. And this market made Mexico one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth, and we see a host of objects there being made there. This is a painting from 1751 showing the interior of a man's bedroom, and at the foot of his bed he has what looks like an imported, probably a Chinese lacquer screen, and behind his head, the headboard is a red lacquer piece that I suspect was made locally in imitation of the Chinese imports. The reason I think it was made locally is that I've seen a number of these, and this is one in a private collection in Mexico. You can see how similar that is. So the artists are trying to replicate the Japanese and Chinese lacquerwares. And I want to conclude with another object that was in the exhibition that to me symbolizes the new globalized world in which it was made. It's a desk and bookcase made in the middle of the 18th century. And the exterior is this incredible riot of geometric inlay, bone and specimen wood inlay that is done in what we'd call a mudéjar or Hispano-Moresque style, a style that is imported into Spain in the 8th century by the Moors. And of course, the Moors occupied Spain for 800 years until the end of the 15th century. And in 1492, the same year Columbus discovers America, Spain launches the Reconquista of southern Spain, and they conquer the Moors, push them out of Spain, and then Spain shifts its attention from internal politics across the Atlantic to the New World. But because the Moors had been in Spain for 800 years, they left behind a strong remnant of Islamic architecture. And so even hundreds of years later, in the 18th century, this style is still popular among indigenous artists in Mexico. But the reason I included this piece in the show was not the exterior, but the interior, which is this incredible chinoiserie style painting in gold on a red background. And it has all these kind of fanciful images that you associate with the European chinoiserie style, which is a kind of a Rococo and late Baroque style that is a kind of a humorous, fantastical take on Asian imports. What's really interesting about this particular piece is that on the doors of the interior section, there are maps. And the two maps on the doors depict a property in Veracruz, Mexico, a large hacienda that was founded in the 16th century. And when I saw the maps for the first time, I realized that they were done by an indigenous artist, because from my introduction, Hillary mentioned that I wrote a book on 16th century maps in Mexico. And I immediately recognized this as an indigenous map-making style that it was common among Central Mexicans. And so I don't know exactly who made the desk, but whoever painted the interior was likely indigenous and was very familiar with the land that was being depicted. And I just show on the screen on the right a 16th century map drawn by an indigenous artist, and I just compare it to the inside of the doors. So this desk actually has a twin sister. It is in a collection in Mexico, and if you put the two desks together, you get 4 different maps of the same property in Veracruz. And this desk was actually in San Francisco in a private collection for years until it's now owned by the MFA, and it was included in the show. And before that, it was in Santa Barbara, California, beginning at least in the 1940s. So what was really interesting about doing this show is that we put a lot of effort into re-identifying or reattributing objects that had been misattributed for years. There were textiles, there were pieces of furniture, there were lacquer pieces that were called Goa or Manila or Spain or whatever, Netherlands. But in fact, they were made in the Americas. We were able to determine that through scientific study and historical study. And we introduced our audiences to an incredible range of art showing that Latin America was very powerful and very global beginning in the 16th century. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all our morning speakers. What a wonderful start of the symposium. So exciting. I'm very pleased to announce our third speaker this morning. Benny Gratha serves as the assistant curator at the Museum Textile Jakarta, where he has been a loyal volunteer since 2005. Gratha studied marine science and technology at Bangor Agricultural University. He is currently working as a freelance consultant for a private collector. His talk today will focus on the myriad cultural influences on the textile arts of the Lampung region of Sumatra, Indonesia. Let's give a warm San Francisco welcome to Benny, who's come all the way from Jakarta.
Thank you very much, Jill. So, the shipcloth is a very interesting topic, but it is also difficult. But this is so mysterious. The topic today is the cross-cultural contact and its effect on the shipcloth weaving tradition. So I will focus on the museum textile collection and several from the private collection where I'm working for to support my presentation today. Let me start with the Sumatra map. So uh, here Sumatra, here is Lampung, just situated along the Sunda Strait, and here is the Banten port, one of the most important trading port and also the enter port to Indonesia. With this situation, so Lampung has long been in contact with many different culture. Among other things are the prehistoric Austronesian and Dongson culture, migration, Hindu, Buddhism, Islam, China, India, Arabia, and also Java and inter-island, and also the European. So the many cultural contact here have been influenced Lampung textile art, including the shipcloth weaving tradition. So I will review a little bit about the shipcloth. So shipcloth is the traditional textile of Lampung, named after the dominant motif of the ship, but the motif not always the ship. There are other motifs also. And shipcloth can be classified into three major forms. One is palapai. This is a long, narrow cloth. And also the tatibin, a smaller version of the palapai. And also the tampan. This is a small rectangular cloth. Here is palapai with the blue sheep and the two tiger that believed to be the guardian of the ancestral home. And here is the tatibin, also with the blue sheep and other small ship here, small boat here. This is the small version of palapai. And this one is the tampan with the water buffalo motif. So now I would like to review a little bit about the function. The palapai is hung on the wall and serve as backdrop to the central figure of ceremony. It belonged to aristocracy, and originally only the penyimbang, the chief of suku or marga, who had the right to use palapai, and it will be inherited to the elder son. But today, all the son of penyimbang use the palapai in the time of social change. But about the tatibin, it's not very much information about tatibin, but it also serves as the wall hanging and covering sitting cushion for person being celebrated. These two kind of textile is made by the paminggir. And the tampan was used in all ceremony event as to cover over the gift and offering, and also a piles of pillow on the pavilion. While the palapai and tatibin is only belong to aristocracy, the tampan is belong to the all class in the Lampung society, and it is a wider distribution than palapai. And the technique, the shipcloth is executed with the supplementary web weaving technique. Here is the foundation with usually the foundation is from the cotton, and this is the supplementary web. The technique itself, it's very old. We don't know whether it could be as long as Australian, who knows. And also the material are silks and cotton and silk. Sometimes this little bit embellishment in the form of metal web thread, flat metal plate, beads, and also imported fabric. So this is the cotton, and this is all the red, and the yellow is silk. Cotton and silk were raised in South Sumatra, while the Tulang Bawang was one place that produced its own silk, according to Jasper. However, there is a possibility that some portion of silk is also imported from China. Or the use of silk is the impact of foreign contact. Also, a report from early Chinese merchants state that silk floss was the popular trade item that sold to the Sriwijaya Empire also in Java and Sumatra. And also Jasper and Piringadi mentioned that the pre-dyed silk thread obtained from the itinerant traders from the Palembang, it possibly from the China or Indian merchant. And I found this metal thread in Palapai and Tatibin in the collection of the museum. The first one is the metallic surface applied with adhesive to paper, wrapping around the fiber core. So the other one is the metallic strip wrapped around the fiber core. So this is two different metal on the Palapai and Tatibin. So metallic thread was never been made in Lampung, but always an imported material. It is believed to have come from China and then later India and from European also. Summerfield in their research found that this one, the metallic surface with adhesive, is derived from the China, while this one is from India. And also the flat metal plate. I found two kinds of flat metal plate in the Palapai, in the Tatibin, sorry. One is taken down in zigzag using the couching embroidery technique, and the other is as a supplementary weft. While the origin of the flat metal plate remain unknown, probably from Europe. And then the couching technique is back to the Tang dynasty. And also I found this imported fabric felt on the Tatibin, probably Europe origin, because the fiber and woolen fabric, it's not locally made. And according to Toton, is a post-17th century innovation. I cannot find the beads embellishment in the collection of museum textile, but I found this beaded palapai on the private collection where I work for. So the background is bark cloth, and then it's covered with this red imported fabric, and then the beads, the glass bead, is sewn onto the background, and with metal embellishment. So the glass bead possibly derived from Indian trade glass beads, while the archaeological evidence suggests that they are circulated much earlier than 18th to 19th century to Indonesia by the Arabia, India, and Chinese merchant. And the style, we found that many geometrical motifs found on the ship cloth. It's like this example here. The use of the hook and the spiral is related to Dangsan culture, while the Dick and de Jong also mentioned that the decorative style with spiral, curve, and tendency to stylize human figure is derived from the Dongson culture, while people, tree, animal, and animal figure are completely taken up into the decorative motif and become inconspicuous, just we see in this example here from the collection of the Museum Textile. This is tampan with the geometric and hook motif. Also, this one in the shape of the tree of life. And also here, it looks like the ancestor home with the human figure here, but it's not clear. The human figure itself, it's very inconspicuous. And also another hooks with human figure here. And another human figure and hooks in the tampan. And also this one. So the tampan in the collection of museum textile mostly geometric like this one. And also another style, so-called monumental style, that frontally plays strongly stylized for the figure, found in this palapa, in this tatibin, sorry. So here we see the ancestor with the horn head, and also several of the horn head they have a different here. And also I found in another tatibin here, and in another palapai. This palapai is folded by two. So, and also we find here the small boat. Another foreign influence that I found in tampan is the geometric floral motif borrowed from patola. So Indian textile that's traded to this Sumatra by Gujarati merchant leave a trail on the textile design on Lampung. And the Indian textile, especially patola, is very high respected in Indonesia, in all over Indonesia, and some of region just copy the motif into the local technique and local beliefs. And of course the elephant, and here is the people riding elephant. Elephant is natural inhabitant, but people riding elephant is probably borrowed from another design, most likely from India. And also Holmgren and Spertus mentioned that it is also possible that Lampung people adopted the Indian concept of elephant as prestige transport and embodied the idea into local custom. And also this tampan is with the wayang-like figure. So this is the influence from Java. While the relationship with Java dated back to 10th century, Hujung Langit inscription tells about the Javanese expeditionary force in Lampung, and then it continues to the Javanese kingdom of Mojopahit, while the Jabung is 15th century Majapahit port, and also continue until now and influence the technique, the shipcloth technique weaving tradition in Lampung. And the European influence we found here is a lion. Probably it is borrowed from the Dutch coin and also the coat of arms that bring by the Dutch United East India Company, VOC, to Sumatra. But also the people in Lampung also use the Dutch coin as the jewelry and to decorate the edge, the woman's skirt, the tapis. Here also depict the blue sheep cloth, and also the big ship is the European influence also, a reminder of the seagoing vessel of the international trader. Possibly because the people in Lampung see a lot of the big ship during the introduction of the VOC in Indonesia. So this palapai is not made in Lampung, but made in Pekalongan. So we'll see here why. Because according to records, the shipcloth weaving tradition in Lampung is vanished during the first quarter of 20th century. It is believed to be the cause of the penetration of Islam, because it's forbidden to draw the living animal and also the human figure, and also the European invasion that changed the society structure in Lampung, and the eruption of the Krakatau in 1883. But in early 1980s, Abdul Qadir from Pekalongan success to revive the shipcloth weaving tradition using the semi-mechanized loom. While in the past, this tradition is always a woman work using the backstripe loom. Now it is a man business using the semi-mechanized loom. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Benny. Our fourth and final speaker today is Dr. Elena Phipps. Elena is an independent textile scholar and curator who received her PhD in the pre-Columbian art history and archaeology from Columbia University in 1989. For over 3 decades, she worked as senior museum conservator in the Textile Conservation Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and served as a special curator in several major exhibitions, including the Colonial Andes, Tapestries and Silverwork, 1430 to 1830. From 2011 to 2014, she served as president of the Textile Society of America. Most recently, Dr. Phipps was a curatorial consultant at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe for a 2015 exhibition, The Red That Colored the World, which was inspired by her 2010 publication, Cochineal Red, The Art History of Color, published by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Yale University Press. She is currently teaching technical and cultural history of world textiles at the University of California in Los Angeles in the Department of World Arts and the cultures at the Fowler Museum. Please welcome Elena.
So today I'm talking about red color, which throughout history and all over the world has had a great deal of meaning. We see it in relation to issues of life and death, birth, rebirth. It has to do with sensuality and sexuality and self-identity. Many cultures around the world create objects with red, and of course today I'm focusing on the textile world, which means that we're dealing with the region of plants and animals that produce a certain color. These are some of the color sources from plants, such as the root of the madder, the flowers of the safflower plant, and heartwoods of various redwoods around the world. And then in the insect world, there are several sources of very brilliant red colors, which were used by people from ancient times till today. But today I'm going to focus on the red which comes from the Americas, cochineal. It is a small insect. On the top you see the male of the species, and the female is the scale insect, which has no wings. She doesn't move. She lays her eggs and produces a red, which was the most prized color throughout history. The cochineal is native to the Americas. It grows on a cactus. Those of you who live in California and have cactus in your garden, you probably get your own version of the wild species of cochineal, which hosts itself on the cactus. She covers herself with a white foamy matter and becomes this incredible resource which was used in the ancient Americas. We know a lot about how cochineal was collected and used because when the Spanish came, when Cortez came to Mexico, he was instructed by the king to find as much grana, as they called this insect red, as possible to be collected with due diligence, and that was as early as 1532. It was his mandate and coming to the New World, which of course they were looking for spices and gold and treasures, but among the treasures that they wanted the most was this source of red color. This is what a dried cochineal insect looks like, and just the other day I put a few grains of cochineal in a nice little brandy glass that belonged to my mother, to show you after just not even 30 seconds, the insect releases its color. And it is for this reason that this particular dye stuff was so popular. While there were other types of sources of reds that were used in China and Europe and Asia and Eastern Asia, all over the world, it is the readily available source and the quantity that this American species yields that made it so popular. In fact, we know that from 1587, in some of the first shipments from the Americas to Spain, 72 tons of cochineal were sent. And even 200 years later, from a very interesting shipwreck that was found off the coast of Louisiana, the Nuevo Constante, we know from the shipping records that they were sending 10,000 pounds of cochineal. Now, what I find very interesting is that when the shipwreck was found in the late 1980s, they actually found some of the other dyestuffs which were part of the shipment. The cochineal, of course, as you see, it's very water soluble, so the cochineal is not there, but they did find several of these leather bags, the zerrones, which is what the Spanish packed the cochineal into. And it's a lousy picture, but I think it's a rare glimpse into how this material was, how it was actually shipped in the holds of the ship. And I would note that this Nuevo Constante also contained 2 kimonos, so we're talking about issues of this global trade. And of course, this trade, and I really liked the map we saw earlier, where you see the shipments are going from Acapulco. There were some also direct shipments from Lima. And the cochineal, which is packed on ships, is sent to Asia. It's sent to Europe. From Europe, it goes both intra-Europe up into the Netherlands, where it is used in all the tapestry industries and the dyeing of silks and all the materials. It goes overland to Krakow and to Kiev and into the upper north, and also, of course, through the southern route over to India and Asia. And we're going to look today at some of this history. What I'd like to do today is look at a little bit about the origins of cochineal in the Americas, and also look at how this global trade not only impacts the cultures to where this material is going, but also how it comes back to the Americas in another form, and this inspiration that it engenders in certain kinds of textile production. So cochineal sources begin in the Americas, both in Mexico and in South America. There's a little bit of a dispute genetically, DNA. Where's the origin? Did it start in the north and move in the south? There's a diversity of insects in Mexico, which make people believe that perhaps the insect originates in Mexico, but the cactus on which it always lives originates in South America. So how the twain met, we don't exactly know the sources. But we know that in Peru, the great textile traditions of the Andes used an incredible amount of red. There were some earlier examples of beautiful red colors which were made from the plant dyes, but it is by the 4th century that we start to see an incredible amount of this brilliant kind of scarlet red, which is used, carmine red, which is found over and over. And I'll just show you a few examples. On my slides, as you will see, I note down below the times in which the actual dye stuff was scientifically analyzed. I had the great privilege of working with the scientific department at the Metropolitan Museum for a project which took over 10 years to examine textiles in order to trace this movement of cochineal around the world. So where you see it says cochineal, it means it really is cochineal and not just an estimate. So we see this use of red in these ritual garments that were made and buried in elaborate burials. That were part of cultural traditions which honored the materials and incredibly creative in their technical production. The Inca, of course, also used cochineal in a very special way in the neck yokes of these checkerboard tunics, which were part of the Royal Army. And in fact, what's very interesting in this piece, which belongs so much to the Boston Museum, I noticed that the black squares of the checkerboard always had a kind of little purplish hue to them. And we were able to analyze it and found, in fact, that even the black is dyed with cochineal. The Inca, we know from colonial documents, had special weavers whose job it was to weave red blankets for the king's white llamas. And the mascaipacha, the fringe worn by the Inca king, was always red. I'm cheating here and showing you the fringe of a beautiful Inca bag, but we don't have any existing mascaipachas, but it is noted in this beautiful colonial painting of an important personage, and it becomes the symbol of Inca kingship. Now, in Mexico, unlike Peru, Peru has hundreds of thousands of ancient textiles that have been preserved in the desert climates. Mexico is another story, and while we know that cochineal was very much part of the Mexican traditions, which we see here from the Matricula de Tributos, which is a list of tribute which was due to Moctezuma, noted in the 16th century. And here we see a page which has the two zurrones. You see it's been noted by Spanish commentators. The zurrones, the leather bags, full of cochineal. And with the flags, which is part of the Nahuatl signifiers of 20, we know that this particular village, which gave to Montezuma feather headdresses and jade beads and bundles of important feathers and painted cotton mantles, that they also gave 40 bags of cochineal every 3 months. There are almost no preserved pre-Columbian textiles from Mexico, and none of them, to my knowledge, have been identified, the dyes have been identified. But I just showed two examples of some interesting ancient Mexican textiles, which perhaps if we have the opportunity in the future to test, we will find that they may have been cochineal. But what we do know from colonial documents was that the beautiful featherwork, especially this mosaic featherwork, which was done in the early 16th century and established by Bernardino Sahagún and documented for the history. This is a feather triptych made entirely of hummingbird feathers. And if you look at on the upper right is the Last Supper, and we see Christ here at the supper with Judah, and Judah with his red bag of coins, which he's been paid to betray Jesus, is in fact, when we look under microscope, we can see there are two kinds of reds. And even Sahagún notes that in these feather triptychs, the cochineal feathers, dyed feathers, are used beneath the naturally red feathers to sort of augment that red, because red feathers were so precious. And in fact, we were able to test this, and it was in fact cochineal. The other thing that we know about Mexican textile traditions in the pre-conquest period was that they used, unlike the Peruvians who had all these beautiful llamas and alpacas and animals which were hair-bearing and made it therefore easy to dye, in Mexico they have rabbit hair and feathers. And we know from early documents that there were textiles that were sent by Cortez to the King of Spain that were made of feathers and rabbit hair, but we never, until very recently, ever saw one. This is a piece which is in the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and luckily we were able to really examine this, and in fact the entire textile, which is a colonial design, but I think very early, and it is completely made of spun rabbit hair and spun white down feathers, and the red, of course, is cochineal. So when we look at all this tons of cochineal which is going to Spain, I wanted to try to find when do we start to see that cochineal in practice. And here it's a very interesting leather chasuble, probably late 16th century, which is gilt with gold leaf on leather, and it is made with flocking. It is made with chopped up little bits of red cloth, which is probably the first real recycled cochineal that we find in Europe. And it's probably from the offcuts of something else that would have been made with this red wool, chopped up and adhered onto the leather, a little bit like perhaps these Elvis velvet paintings kind of idea. It has that nappy surface. The Italians were very against the use of cochineal, and the silk weavers guilds were extremely prohibitive of using this so-called foreign red, and only slightly later in the century did they start to accept it, but then it was deemed that red velvets dyed with a foreign red had to have a green selvage with a single silver stripe in it. I was able to look at the over 600 examples of velvets, of Italian velvets in the Metropolitan's collection, and I happily found 3 pieces, all of which had this green selvage and a silver stripe. The Italians especially had close relations with the Ottoman Empire, and trunkfuls of cochineal, we know, were sent to the sultans and then also made their way over even further east. We know that the Italian velvets and the Ottoman velvet industries had a lot of exchange in terms of the aesthetic, and there's very interesting issues about identifying what's Italian and what's Turkish. But one way that we can look at it are in the dye stuffs, as well as the technique of the velvet. And this happens to be one which likely has the American cochineal. We saw some very interesting examples of this trade from through the Portuguese to Asia, and especially to Japan. And here I would just note these interesting rolls which are on the ship, which are being offloaded into Japan from one of the scrolls. One of the things which became currency in this global trade was first the silver from the Americas, and also the woolen cloth from Europe, the red woolen cloth. Now, the red woolen cloth was made in Spain, in the Netherlands, and in England. The quantities of cochineal which were used to produce a lot of this so-called trade cloth was enormous. There are other reds which are also used. The Dutch had a lot of access to an Asian type of red called lac, and some of the Dutch cloth, in fact, was dyed with this other source. But the Dutch perfected this way of making this sort of orangey red, which is called scarlet red. This scarlet red is a cochineal red, which is a little different than our typical view of what cochineal looks like. But it is this red cloth which was filling the boats of the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company, the British East India Company, that was bringing this red woolen cloth to Asia as gifts and as items of barter, basically as currency. It's very interesting that we find red garments from the Tokugawa era in Japan, made of this red cloth that was brought by the bolts. And excuse me, I should have said that these are only partial bolts of cloth that are still in a museum in Japan. There's quite a bit that's been preserved there. So here we see these surcoats of the warrior class wearing these red British or Dutch or Spanish woolen cloth. We find the red cloth as a ground of beautiful ceremonial pieces in Indonesia and all over Southeast Asia. we find this red trade cloth as the bits around the ceremonial masks and statues. Here he has a small bit of red cloth, and you start to see the kind of amulet concept of red cloth. It might be just a little bit of it, but it is a powerful component of these ritual objects. And of course, the red coats of the British Army was a symbol of their power and identity. And of course, the British at that point were getting their cochineal through piracy. They were stealing the cochineal from the Spanish ships because the Spanish maintained their monopoly on the trade of cochineal well into the 18th century. This red cloth is found in objects of Native America. It was brought back to the Americas. And what I find very interesting in some of these pieces is that you see these white strips often in the items of Native American objects, that the white strips were the remnants of the dyeing process. That is, this was white wool that was dyed into huge vats of cochineal or other red sources, but in order to dip them into this vat, there would be a metal bar that it would be attached to, and that bar would act as a reserve, and so the dye didn't penetrate it. So I think it's fascinating to see these little bits of white, which are part of the bolts of cloth, and you can imagine that how that was brought into these trading agreements with the Native American groups. The Navajo, as great weavers, took red cloth and unraveled it and respun it in order to use in Navajo blankets. And it was really a primary mechanism for distributing a lot of these cochineal sources. I want to look a little bit at the influence of how some of the other trade items, which were very important. So the Americas was sending out all these raw materials, but India, of course, was a primary source of these dyed and painted textiles. India had its own source of red. In fact, they rejected the shipments of cochineal that were sent to them in the 18th century. But these pieces of dyed Indian cloth came through the Manila galleons that we saw this morning, and we have evidence of their use in both Mexico and Peru. Very amazingly, just a few years ago, this piece on the left, an Indian chintz, was discovered in an excavation of a Spanish 16th century house just outside of Lima. And it just confirms in some of these Indian dye-painted cloths, there's incredible interest in how the Indian dyers in East India were able to get red and various shades onto their cotton cloth. This was something that no one understood how to do. Oh, I have to start all over? Yeah. Yes, great, perfect. You can go in an exhibition that I worked on for the Metropolitan Museum called about global trade. We did a small video showing the stages of dyeing. The Europeans didn't understand how to do it, and it was a very complex series of processes that resulted in the copperplate printing of the Toile de Jouy and these other French printing industries that tried to understand and imitate the Indian method of dyeing color on cotton, and especially red. And it was actually in Mexico in the 1780s that they found a way to print cochineal on cotton, and that industry became something called the Indianillas, which was the Mexican version of the Indian printed cloth. It's a very interesting story. Dennis didn't show this masterpiece that's in the MFA Boston, which also is other evidence of this, another kind of influence of the Chinese textiles, which were coming through the Manila Galleons to the Americas. This is actually a Peruvian tapestry. It is woven completely by Andean weavers, but following the templates of some of the Chinese tapestries which were coming in through the trade. I'll just show you a very beautiful detail. And what's very interesting is it is a combination of Chinese silk and Andean camelid hair, like alpaca, and also some Spanish metal silver threads, like we saw also were brought into to Indonesia. And also it became an influence, this Chinese silk dyed with cochineal, with American cochineal, used in a certain kind of Bolivian textile tradition called tornasol, which was an imitation of Spanish silks. So it's this very interesting dialogue of cultures between the materials and the techniques, and then the mimicking of one culture by another and integrating into new ways of expressing themselves through textiles. The Chinese, who of course loved red and had a major source of use of red as a symbol of happiness, and from very early on, also took to the cochineal as their source of red, and this is an example in the 19th century of a panel. And I just want to end with an interesting group of materials, which is actually here in the Bay Area, and probably as the result of the Mexican trade from that came up with the California missions, and the idea that there are many examples of Chinese vestments, red vestments that were made in China, possibly with cochineal. We haven't had an opportunity to test this one, but there's some very interesting local issues about local global issues to do with this region, and sort of untapped areas of investigation for this trade, of course, in the ecclesiastical world and its influences. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Hello, I'd like to invite our speakers up to the front of the auditorium for a question and answer session. Thank you all for your presentations, and thank you all for attending today. I'm Laura Camerlingo, and I'll be moderating today's question and answer session. And to give you a sense of what we'll be doing, I'm going to ask that you please raise your hand. I'll call on you, ask you to say your question, and then I'll repeat your question into the microphone. The acoustics in here are a bit tricky, so saying it into the microphone will allow everyone to hear the question, and then our speakers will respond. So, any questions? So to repeat the question is the orange red supplemented with anything, or is it just cochineal?
Is this on? Is this? Yes. Cochineal is a type of dye that requires what's called a mordant, which is a mineral salt, and usually because people love that brilliant red color, they use a mordant which is very neutral and doesn't alter the color. But the Dutch and the British in a certain period discovered the use of tin as a mordant, and that yields this very orange color. What I always found very interesting is that madder, which is the European primary source of red, which is the root of the Rubiaceae plants, yields a very orange color. So it's almost as if, to me, this scarlet red, this kind of more carmine red, that is the natural insect red. It's almost as if they wanted to mimic their more traditional red color, although it's very, very bright. And there's a lot of very interesting literature written by Dominique Cardon on the history of some of the European scientific investigations into modifying that red color. Shades are very important, I'll just say.
More cochineal. So the question, So the question is, how do you get black out of cochineal?
Well, there are two things. We found the black Inca tunic, probably the original color of the fiber was black, and they are adding cochineal to deepen it. In the same way that Rembrandt also used cochineal as a dye, but we found the cochineal as use it as a painting pigment, and he used it in his shadows. It deepens black. The ability to create black dyes and black paint is a very complex thing. We think of white, black being such a simple color or absence of color, but from a painting and a dyeing perspective, it's very difficult. So cochineal plays a role in both of those media.
What's the difference between the American cochineal and is it Armenian cochineal?
I showed pictures of cochineal lac.
Sorry. So the question is, what's the difference between American cochineal and Armenian cochineal?
So cochineal from the Americas, various insects from Eastern Europe. There's a Polish version and an Armenian version, and then there's lac from Southeast Asia, and the kermes from Europe. They all have a technical fingerprint, which allows us to separate them because of the acid component of certain parts of the colorant. What is very difficult is the Armenian cochineal and the American cochineal share a fingerprint, and it is still very difficult from a scientific point of view to separate them. So we cannot always say if something is Armenian or American. There are different species, and they live on different plants, and they eat different things. They have different behavior as insects, but chemically they're very close.
Because it seems as though from the pictures that American caught on and Armenian didn't.
Well, the Armenian cochineal lives in the roots of grasses, and they come out from the base of Mount Ararat in that region. They come out once a year. There are very few of them. They're harder to gather. The American cochineal is on the cactus. They can feed them and make them grow over several life cycles, and it's a different collecting process rather than from the wild. They cultivate them in Mexico.
So the question is about the symmetricality or asymmetricality of the sails.
The splashboard.
The floorboard, sorry.
Yeah. You're challenging my imperfect memory of some work by an anthropologist called Giancarlo Scoditi, who's done a lot of work on Trobriand's canoes and particularly on those splashboards. And the thing is that when you're sailing with an outrigger, you don't have a prow and a stern because you turn the ship according to the wind so that the splashboard is always on, so that the outrigger is always on one side. And for that reason, the ship, when the wind is blowing in the sail, ideally the outrigger is just lifted out of the water so it's not dragging. And so from an aesthetic point of view, what the bulbous, uneven shape of the splashboard does is actually rebalance the horizon as you look forward. So it's an aesthetic management of the eye. And I'm not doing a lot of justice to Scoditi's very good analysis of that, but that is the principle that he has expanded at some length and very interestingly. Yeah. The question was about the dyes on the sails for those boats. So the photos that I showed you were mostly of undyed sails, but in the Western Pacific, there was a lot of dyeing of pandanus using the bark of the root of a vine, whose name is just going to elude me at this moment. I mean the scientific name. It grows it's cultivated quite widely through Melanesia, and it has to be processed by scraping and boiling. And so it doesn't actually make a bright, certainly nothing like cochineal. It makes more of a kind of blood brown, dried blood brown, but it's always called red, and it was much valued. And so but it's a lot of work to dye a sail. So it's very interesting I need to do a lot more looking. I haven't found a red dyed sail yet in any museum collection, so yeah.
Add that dyeing of plant fibers like the pandanus and other is extremely difficult, and very few cultures manage to get color onto these kinds of leaf fibers. And
Yeah, thank you.
I have questions for all of you, but I'm going to try to narrow it down here. But first of all, I would like to ask about your specified the Lapita, made reference to the Lapita people going out towards Polynesia, and from your academic perspective, well-informed, the notion of Austronesian speakers versus some people quibble about the idea of calling people Austronesians. You did not mention that. But of course we have Indonesia, Madagascar, Easter Island, with Austronesian language. Genetic markers are suggesting a relation. I'd just like to find out what your opinion is, how you would use, what language you would use to refer to these populations.
Thank you. The question, I'll repeat it, was about the Lapita people who were speaking languages which are called Austronesian, and you're asking that you're commenting that I didn't use the word Austronesian or make a play for that, and you were just asking my view of that, as I understand that. So the Lapita people who, as you saw on that map, came in from Southeast Asia into the Pacific were speaking languages which we classify as Austronesian, and all the languages of the Pacific, because everyone who in the main part of the Pacific is descended from those people, speak languages which we classify as Austronesian, and they also went into Indonesia and all the way across to Madagascar, as you said. I didn't particularly launch into that, because once you launch into that, that's a whole long discussion, but they were coming in, and when they got to northern New Guinea, that area was already inhabited by people who'd come in this in the settlement of Sahul, that large continent of Australia and New Guinea. And so there was the archaeologists have big arguments about how much they mixed and to what extent the Austronesian speakers with the pottery just went shooting on and totally just ignored the inhabitants of northern New Guinea. But so the people who first went through were making the pottery, and they're called Lapita people. They gradually stopped making the pottery, settled down, but their descendants went on and settled the whole Pacific, and all of them were Austronesian, even though they had that connection with the Papuan speakers in New Guinea. So there's a mixture of languages in New Guinea. So I don't know if I've quite answered your question, because I'm not sure. But anyway, that's my sense of it.
Are you, in your professional position, sometimes using the expression Austronesian people?
Oh, I see.
This, as somebody online I've been reading, says is verboten, and you can only speak of Austronesian speaker people. That seems
yes.
awkward.
So the question is, what's the use of the term Austronesian? I would tend to use it only for the languages, so I would say Austronesian speakers or Austronesian languages. But some people do use it as if they were a people. But there's so much diversity in those communities that what links them is the language. I think that's the best way to answer that.
So, question if Spanish galleon ended up in Hawaii or Polynesian islands?
I have found no evidence of that. It's not an area that I research myself personally, but I'm not aware that any of the galleons ended up in Hawaii. They tended to go pretty far north, following the trade winds across the Pacific. And there are lots of shipwrecks off the coast of Manila and on the coast of the United States and Mexico, but nothing that I'm aware of in the middle of the Pacific.
Additional questions?
To answer the question, in the Marquesas, there have been some shipwrecks found with Spanish cannon dated to a style of cannon from the 1500s, whatever century that is, and also an emerald ring. That's north of the Marquesas, a bit in the southern Tuamotus.
Also, to follow up on that, David, is that there was a book written about 50 years ago in Hawaii, and about that a Spanish galleon had actually drifted off and shipwrecked there. It's very interesting because there's Hawaii is a Stone Age culture basically, and there's a word for metal in the native language. So that's why we ask. And actually, somebody's told me that there's a remnant of a Spanish galleon in Kealakekua Bay. I don't know whether it's true or not.
Further questions? Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add on to that, taken away from the Spanish piece, but in Hawaiian oral history and chant, there in the chants it talks about during ancient times how Hawaiians sailed to what many Hawaiian scholars believe, native Hawaiian scholars believe, was South America or Mexico. So as I was listening, I was trying to see if there was any pieces of that in the presentation during the trade.
The question about where Pacific Islanders got to and how far they spread. And I think what has happened is because the first Europeans in the Pacific made the assumption that Pacific Islanders basically were stuck on their islands and couldn't go anywhere. It's been very hard for European scholarship to kind of turn its head around and understand that people on those canoes could go far. But we do know that Pacific Islanders got to South America. And so your question was specifically about Hawaiians, but there's no reason why not. I think we just don't understand how much people were moving around. For sure, those early Lapita people got to Australia. And for sure there's beginning to be a little bit of evidence of them on the east coast of Queensland. But of course there's not much archaeology done to know. So the wealth of human activity that we don't yet know about is very exciting. That's what I would say.
How much of the oral tradition in the way of genealogy chants is used in scholarship?
I can't answer that very well because I'm a Western Pacific person, not an Eastern Pacific person, and Western Pacific don't use genealogies in the same way. But I guess actually I can't answer that. I shouldn't try. Yeah.
I thought I saw a hand on the right. Yes.
I just wondered if there's any evidence of them using the pandanus sails in the kula canoes in the trograms, because I know they're still using the splashboards, and if there's any evidence in the canoes. I was there, but I don't recall seeing it.
I'm sorry. You were asking about using pandanus sails still in the cooler canoes. I don't actually know, but I think it has that photograph was from the 1980s was of a pandanus sail. So they are still used in local trading in the islands, but not in the big sailing canoes because there aren't big sailing canoes in the Western Pacific anymore.
More questions?
About the ship's cloths and Bakalongan, are they still being made there? And are they available? And what's the quality?
Yes, it is still being made in Pekalongan, but it is you have to order, and it took time, but the quality is similar. Only the threads that they use is commercial thread, and also the color is the chemical dyes.
In the back.
Yes, I have a question regarding the beautiful wooden cabinet that you showed. There was a bookcase, and on the outside it was Islamic design, inside Chinese, and it was actually painted by Mexican. Were the Islamic designs and the Chinese designs incorporated in it, do you think, simply because they liked the way they looked, it was pure aesthetics, or was there any other significance attached to the application of those foreign designs in an indigenous product?
So a question about the meaning behind the designs found on the cabinet you mentioned in your presentation.
So the outside of that desk and bookcase has Islamic designs. What I didn't mention is that the moldings around those designs they look a lot like Dutch ripple moldings. And the sides are inlaid in a very Germanic or Central European style with vine and berry inlay. And then the form of it as a desk and bookcase really isn't a Spanish form. In Spain, they would typically use what they call an escritorio, or a kind of square or rectangular box of drawers that's a writing cabinet. And that form of a desk and bookcase with a bookcase on top of a slant front desk, that's really an Anglo-Dutch form. So just on the outside, you've got German, Dutch, English, and Islamic designs. And then the inside, of course, is the chinoiserie mixed with indigenous Mexican design. So the question you raised is whether, is this just a pure interest in putting together styles, or is there something deeper behind it? And I think, for me, the desk and bookcase and its identical twin sister desk, they're models of the Spanish Empire in this period, which had its roots in Asia, across the Americas, but also in Central Europe, and even in Italy. So to me, it's like this looking back at this this past of the Spanish Empire that was, like, by that point the desk was made, was already in decline.
I would add a textile aspect to that, which is when you showed the inside and this idea of this red lining. I mean, to me, it's a parallel to, you know, the red lining of a woman's dress, or, you know, there's something very evocative about that red, and the fact that it's on the inside, so you have this discrete thing, but then when you open it up, it's very powerful. And we know, for example, that lots of the ecclesiastical garments which were made in Mexico of Chinese silks, and often they were specifically, they wanted this red Chinese silk lining for these vestments. And I don't know, there's something intimate about that red that's very evocative, and I think there's a little bit of an aesthetic parallel to that.
And there's one further aspect that I forgot to mention. When you open the writing surface, we see a view of Mount Parnassus from classical literature. But in fact, and with all the muses, you know, inhabiting the mountain, but in fact, in this particular view, the Mexican view, there's not a single mountain, but two mountains. And I think those are the twin volcanoes of central Mexico. So there's another kind of aspect of this desk. It's a very complicated, very global object.
Yes, in the back.
Is there a name attributed to the painters or designers of this piece?
The question is what? Hello? The question is whether there's a name attributed to the designers or the painters of the piece, and so far we don't know. We know quite a bit about the furniture manufactories in Puebla, which is in central Mexico, but I think that the person who painted the inside was probably located in Veracruz, or they had access to the specific indigenous maps of this property, this particular hacienda that's called La Estanzuela. Now, we found in the court records in Mexico City a 500-page court case that is a land dispute over this exact hacienda. And it's an 18-year case, and it ends in 1748. And we were thinking, just stylistically, that the two desk and bookcases might date to the middle of the 18th century. I just wonder whether they date to around 1748, after the conclusion of this epic court case, in which you so proudly proclaim your ownership of this land.
Could the red paint be cochineal?
The
Not likely.
Yeah, the question is whether the red paint could be cochineal. It's unlikely. In fact, the material that's painted, the red material, is a type of pre-Hispanic Mexican material that is a mixture of chia seed oil. Chia seeds are back in fashion, but they used to use them for a paint medium. Chia seeds. Yeah, there's an indigenous beetle that they use, a fat from an indigenous beetle mixed with clay and other pigments to create this red that's, in the pre-Hispanic period, was used to coat gourd cups to keep them watertight, also make them colorful. But once the Asian lacquers start arriving, the same material that was used for probably thousands of years morphs into something that's so similar to the Asian lacquer. It's shiny, it's hard, it's water resistant, it's very colorful. And they start calling it in the period laca, which is the Spanish word for lacquer, or make, which I think is derived from makie, the Japanese word for lacquer. So it's so conscious that they're thinking about imported Asian lacquers, but using an indigenous material.
Okay, but I have to say that a lot of a lot of Asian lacquer actually comes from a plant source, but most of the material that we call shellac is the outer component of the lac insect, which is found all over Southeast Asia, which is the very brilliant red dye. So sometimes that lacquer is the shellac, which is from the laca. I mean, that's the connection.
And we can take one more question. Yes.
Because mostly the ship cloth, they tell a story about the ship and the people inside, and also the animal, the living creatures in the Lampung. So I think because of the Islamic teaching that not allowed to draw the human figure and also the living animal, so the tradition is slowly stopped. So, and then also the Islam teaching prevent they to sorry. This is because this is related to the tradition also, the tradition that the ship cloth should be hang during the tradition, like for example, for the weddings and for the any rites of passage in Lampung, which is Islam is not allow this tradition. Yes, in 80s, there's they try one people from Pekalongan try to revive the tradition. But are they still Islamic? No, this it's not Islamic, but it's back to the original version of the ship cloth.
Thank you all very much.